At a private suburban shooting range, Mara Delgado, quiet, unassuming, a woman who keeps to simple routines, meets Commander Cole Mercer, a celebrated SEAL whose swagger and entitlement have hardened into cruelty. When Mercer publicly humiliates her by spitting in her face, Mara responds not with a fist, but with a single, practiced motion that neutralizes him in 5 seconds. The story follows the lead-up to that flash of violence, revealing Mara's hidden history, the cost of pride, and the fragile line between public performance and private truth. Cinematic and emotionally resonant, the tale explores power, humiliation, and quiet justice. How dignity can be reclaimed not through spectacle but through the steady mastery of self. The rain had come down slow and white that morning, as if the sky hesitated to commit, and had left the asphalt of the range parking lot smelling like iron and old fires. Mara Delgado wiped her palms on the sides of her jeans and watched the droplets bead on the canvas awning above the firing line. The smell of gun oil, wet canvas, and coffee from the little concession booth braided itself with the damp air. It was a smell she had lived with for years and had learned to love in a private, stubborn way. It smelled of work that demanded attention and of small, exacting rituals. Chamber checks, eye protection, the crisp click of a spent casing kissing concrete. Mara had been at Valencia Range since dawn, sweeping brass and sweeping away the leftover ghosts of the night's practice. The range was a rectangle of ordered noise, the rhythm of rounds, the polite distance between strangers, the particular etiquette that kept violence from becoming chaos. It took discipline to keep it that way. She kept it. Not because she wanted the responsibility, it was a habit, like breathing, but because order calmed the vertigo in her chest. Order kept the world from tipping into the exquisite cruelty she'd seen too often elsewhere. That morning, the clientele leaned towards the weekend warriors and a corporate training group that smelled faintly of aftershave and new suits. Sam, the owner, leaned against the register, a former cop with soft shoulders and a patient face. He nodded at Mara and pointed to a handful of new targets he'd set up on Lane 6. "Got a commander coming through," he said, voice low. "Big talker. Wants a private lane." "Commander?" Mara asked. She could count on one hand the number of true SEALs who came through these parts. Most high-profile types went to the private, faraway facilities with manicured ranges and lawyers on speed dial. A commander meant pedigree, and pedigree often meant people who mistook bravado for skill. Sam shrugged. "Wants a controlled space. Pays cash." Mara nodded. She could tell from Sam's face, without another word, don't make it bigger than it is. People's delusions come to the range to be admired, not confronted. That was the price of her job. She kept the friction low, the heat contained. They set him up in Lane 6, near the back where the light slants long and the roofs mouth the rain. He arrived with people, 4 men, 2 younger, an older man who looked like a PR consultant, and a woman who let her heels click like punctuation. The commander walked like a man who knew the world owed him vantage, boots that never quite smudged out, shoulders squared as though someone would forever rear their head to salute. He had a face that had been honed by cameras and command. It was handsome in a blunt, practiced way, with a jaw that refused to show softness. Cole Mercer announced himself to the room in the way men like him did, a voice meant to be noticed. "Commander Cole Mercer," he said, and the group laughed in the way men laugh when they meet their own reflection in a polished day. He removed his hat in the netherworld between the canopy and the targets as though it were a ritual, and set his gear on the bench like stage props. When he looked at Mara, his eyes slid over her like a glance through gauze, somewhere between curiosity and boredom. "You're the range master?" he asked, voice like gravel and money. Mara nodded. "I'm one of the instructors." He smirked the way people smirked when they could not be bothered to remember names. "Good. We'll need the lane to ourselves. Company policy." "Lane 6 is yours, sir," Mara said. She gave no inflection of welcome, just the bare, professional outline of permission. She had learned early not to flatter men whose work was spectacle. The range demanded safety, not ego. Cole's crew began their routine, checking sites, whispering about targets, about recent operations, about near-mythic things that smelled faintly of exaggeration. People at ranges liked to tell stories. It was the sound of men rehearsing their courage. At Lane 7, a young man named Derek, thin, green in muzzled discipline but eager, fumbled a weapon and dropped a shell. He caught Mara's eye. She mouthed the universal caution, then returned to sweeping. A soft aversion hummed in her, as if safety were a violin string that could snap. She did what instructors do. She watched. She watched the angles, the stances, the cadence of breathing. As the morning warmed, the range grew louder. Mercer's voice rose, an acoustic of command. Anecdotes of doors kicked open, of people reduced to the flat facts of battle, of impossible missions with impossible timelines. He punctuated his stories with gestures and the kind of smiled cruelty that makes other men perk up. People often mistook cruelty for strength, and that era kept the world messy. From the corner of her eye, Mara watched him wield his authority, the way he redirected the room's attention like a hand sweeping crumbs from a table. Then, with the abruptness of a snapped twig, he turned to her. "You," he said, and pointed. "You with the broom. Come here." Sam's eyebrows rose. Mara did not want the attention, but there was no retreat. The range needed a figure to anchor the etiquette, and she was that figure. She joined him at lane 6. Close up, she could see the little things, a faint scar at the juncture of his brow, a lip that tightened in a way that kept his smile from arriving too soon. His hands were steady, sure, and the pride in his bearing had the sheen of lacquer. "You look like you know your way around a Glock," he said, scanning her profile as a man scans a map for the best route. "You done any real shooting? Anything interesting?" Mara felt the question like a pebble lodged in a shoe. She had the uncomfortable, private knowledge that when a man like Cole Mercer used interesting, it was code for performance. "I instruct," she said simply. "Grip, stance, sight alignment, safety." He smiled as if she had given him a joke. "Instructing is a noble thing. I admire the caretaker class." The words were a courtesy dipped in contempt. The others chuckled. Even Sam, standing back near the register, shifted his weight and tried to act like a mediator of polite distance. Mara could feel the old things rearrange in her chest, the careful training that made her patient and observant, the story she would leave for her own memory at night. There was no fear in her, not the kind that shrieks and runs. There was a low, combustible disappointment that men like him believed in the rightness of their humiliation. "How about a demonstration?" Mercer said, glancing almost in jest at the line of shooters. "Show us how a girl like you would clear a stoppage." A pause fell like a breath. The men at his party looked at her as at a curiosity in a display case. The woman in heels shifted. The PR man filmed with a phone. Derek snuck a look that mixed awe and apology. Mara's hands, weathered with work, curled around the broomstaff like an extension of herself. She had been through worse crowds than this. The training she had shelved long ago lay like a tool she wasn't ashamed to own. It was not that she sought violence. It was that violence had a vocabulary, and she knew it better than most because she had listened to it speak. "Demonstration?" Mara asked. Her voice was quiet. It always was. Quiet was often the best tool. Mercer's smirk widened. "Yeah. You lot show us something. Or maybe shame me with your safety theater." He turned away as if to fetch a magazine, and his men leaned into a conversation about birds and bullets. The PR woman idly replayed a clip on her phone. Sam mouthed something to the effect of "ignore him," and when that failed, worked the register with the caring touch of a man who had seen his share of fights diffuse into cursing. Mara's fingers brushed the bench, remembering the weight of protective equipment and the careful pull of magazine release. Her fingers felt the memory of training settle like sediment. She did not reach for a gun. She did not brandish strength. She let the broom rest in her hands and breathed. And then Cole Mercer stepped close, too close, leaning as if to show her the proper way to stand, the proper way to take up space. The movement was an invasion, not violent enough to provoke, precisely calibrated to humiliate. He placed a hand near her shoulder, as if to steady his own theater. "You don't need to be afraid of me," he said. So smooth it could have been the script of 100 men who had meant to own a room and wound up emptying it. Mara felt something hot and small ignite in her chest. She had lived enough to know that humiliation goes nasty when it is allowed to huddle and grow. She met his eyes. There was steel in them, and something else, an old habit of assessing. Mercer thought he was making a tableau, his dominance, her discomfort. He misread the story by a margin wide enough to drown in. He spat. It was small and casual, the way a man clears his mouth, An unconsidered act, a trespass. The droplet hit Mara's cheek like a punctuation mark. The room went still for a breath as if all the doors had closed at once. The world narrowed into the wet line that traced down her face. People around them laughed, nervous, uncertain laughter. The PR woman stopped recording for half a second. Derek's fingers tightened white around his pistol. Sam's jaw tensed. Humiliation, when timed right, is a kind of cruelty that pretends to be insignificant. That was Cole's strength, the ability to erase the other by reducing them to a moment of shame. But he had miscalculated the quiet. Mara didn't swear. She didn't scream. She didn't slap him or scream for him to be ejected. She wiped the spit in a slow, deliberate motion that felt like a ritual. She set the broom down against the bench with the care of someone rehung armor. The world seemed to hold its breath, savoring the drama. "You do not get to do that here," she said. The words were measured, each as precise as a round. "We have rules." Cole laughed. "Oh, come on. It was a joke. Toughen up." Mara stepped in, never raising her voice, but closing the small distance between them. Mercer's smile flickered. Surprise does that, briefly honest, before the practiced mask returns. He tried to recover his posture, to be large and righteous and amused. She smelled the aftershave and the metallic tang of his temper. He reached, not clumsily, but with the casual assumption of possession, for the inside of his jacket where the holster sat. The motion was one of pride unthinking. He wanted everyone to know he was armed, to remind them that his narrative included a weapon. Mara moved faster than anyone anticipated. She moved with a quietness that belonged to people who keep a room's rhythm in their bones. Her hands found the material of his jacket, a practice touch, and in a motion that was all leverage and pivot. She used his own forward step against him. She hooked his wrist and twisted his arm down, then spun him off balance. He, perfect in combative training, perfect in conditioned reaction, still found himself in the center of someone else's carefully applied physics. The bench toppled with a thunk, a chair scraped. For a heartbeat, the world blurred into adrenaline soundtrack. The takedown took 5 seconds. 1. Mara hooked his wrist with a thumb press and a pivot of her hips. She felt the tendon in his forearm pop slightly into a position she'd felt before 100 times in practice. A small, odd satisfaction lodged in her, like a craftsman finding a plane's edge shaving wood. 2. She stepped in with her shoulder to his torso, rotating so that his center of gravity shifted off his heels. Mercer, who had built his life on the certainty of his stance, found his footing betray him. 3. Mara slid her other hand under his arm, gripping the leather of his holster. It was not violence. It was a negotiation with inertia. The holster came free, not because she was stronger. She wasn't, but because she chose the angle where resistance is a lie. 4. The firearm, a heavy thing and a declaration, clattered to the concrete. It landed near Derek's shoe, a small, obscene punctuation. Everyone's breath left them at once. 5. Mara finished the motion by sweeping his legs with a step that spoke of timing. Commander Cole Mercer hit the ground like a man who had not believed gravity had rights. He sprawled, stunned, his face a composition of surprise and disbelief. For the first time that morning, the armor of his arrogance had a crack. The group around him made the involuntary noise of people realizing their myth had slipped. There was no flourish was required. It was over. Mercy, the kind of mercy that lives in control, kept Mara from stomping triumphant. She brought his wrist behind his back and settled him into a cuff-like hold she could keep until help arrived. Her arms wrapped around him in a manner that said, "You cannot move. You do not get to move." Silence hung heavy. The PR woman had the phone in her hand, but she wasn't sure whether to film or to call someone. Derek, who had never seen someone get disarmed so quickly, looked both cowed and luminous with the vicarious thrill of survival. Sam, for once, had no wise words. Mercer's breath came loud and fast, the sound of someone surprised at his own vulnerability. "What the hell is this?" Mercer barked, trying to lurch, trying to find the language he owned. "You spit on me," Mara said. She did not shout. Her voice was the orthodontic clack of fact. "That's assault." "Assault," Mercer repeated, incredulous. He tried to smear the situation into dismissal. "I'm a commander. You tried to take my..." You reached for a weapon in public and spat on a staff member, Mara said. You allowed your ego to endanger people. His men began to circle with varying expressions: fury, defensiveness, the calculation of allies deciding whether to stand or evaporate. The PR woman finally found the word that bound her to the moment. Should I call security? She asked, like someone flipping the script in panic. Sam had already moved. He stepped forward, his hands out in the old supplicating stance of someone who'd spent years keeping the peace. Cole, you need to calm down, he said, voice rough with the authority of someone who'd been in more fights than he wanted to remember. We can't have weapons flying. You can't spit on staff. You can't put a man in a headlock at your range, Mercer said, indignation recovering its confidence. He had the thrum of entitlement, the old arrogance like a blanket thrown over the truth. Mara kept her hold. She could have crushed his wrist. She could have let it go. She chose instead restraint. Her hands were steady. She was not drunk with triumph. She was simply, finally, done being small. One of his men edged forward, the one with the tight eyes, the advanced training. You're clean, he said after an equivocal pause, an admission. No discharge. He misses a step. We can walk. But the video had already started. The PR woman had followed instinct and begun to film. Derek had recorded too, his hands trembling with a new kind of fidelity. When you do something like that now, it lives. It will outlaw speech. It will reach corners that menus of power think they own. Mercer's face flushed a slow, violent red. He had been toppled by a woman he had deemed simple. The irony stung him. When men who had built identity on dominance found that fragility is universal, they unclenched like people in a dream. You can't live in here like this, he muttered. It was not a threat as much as a complaint. He was less dangerous angry than he had been smug. Mara pressed his wrist with a little more force to underline the point. He did not get to keep moving. His arm no longer purchased him the world. A police officer finally arrived, summoned by Sam when he realized the incident could bleed into something more messy. He had the shy, careful manner of a man who preferred paperwork to confrontation. He listened to both sides. He took statements. He asked for surveillance footage. He watched the clip on someone's phone and frowned like a man reading scales. Cole Mercer, still fumbling with the concept that he had been made small in a public space, tried to intone his rank. You don't understand who I am, he said with the old cadence of men who thought job titles conferred inviolability. You don't understand that spitting on someone is assault, Sam said. The police officer's face was a small island of patience. Sir, we'll need you to calm down. You're an instructor here. We'll need your account. Mara told her story. She spoke where things had happened, slow and even. Truth, in her voice, had the texture of old leather, worn, flexible, impossible to fake. When she finished, the officer scribbled. He looked at his partner and sighed. You handled it, he said finally, the implication being both relief and warning. No one got hurt, but this could go further. Mercer tried to sew the moment into victimhood. He filed a complaint about being manhandled. He phoned someone high up and used the language of influence, the currency his life had been minted on. The police officer listened with a damp, weary understanding of someone who had seen many men try to translate bruised pride into paperwork. The video leaked to the internet before the day fulled. That night, in the glow of 1,000 small screens, Mara watched the clip for the first time. She sat in her small kitchen with a mug of tea that had gone lukewarm and watched herself move, quiet, precise, without dramatics. She watched the angle of his reach, the way his hand had found his holster as if that was permission to dominate. She watched her own hands, steady, and she felt no pride in overthrow. She felt the old, cool clarity of someone who had used a skill to protect a space. News anchors and comment threads took their fractal bites. Some called it a heroic takedown. Woman fights arrogant warrior, triumphs. Some called it provocation, a scandal. There were think pieces that tried to fold the narrative into cultural war. The PR woman's video performance had already become a currency someone wanted to spend. In the small, private aftermath, Mara sat with Sam and Derek and the regulars as people chewed the bone of what had happened. She had expected a little more praise than the world would deliver. She was not hungry for headlines. She liked the smell of grease paint on the bench, the ordinary noise of a day unremarkable. People think it's about the move, Sam said, stirring coffee. They don't get it. It's about choice. You made him stop. Mara touched the rim of her mug. He made it personal, she said. He could have been embarrassed and left. He didn't. He escalated. That's on him. Derek, who kept glancing at her like someone looking at a lighthouse through fog, asked the question with the tremor of one who had finally learned to ask. Did you train for that? Like, did you expect it? Mara smiled. I trained for a lot of things, she said. But I didn't expect him to spit. I expect little in this world. That leaves more room for what matters. Over the weeks that followed, Cole Mercer did what men of his class do when faced with humiliation. He tried to reclaim the narrative. He hired lawyers who cast aspersions. He questioned the meaning of assault and tried to rewrite the morning as a misunderstanding. There were op-eds from men who thought nuance was a muzzle for truth. There were women who wrote in about every time they'd been spat on and how rare it was for the world to respond. The range got more customers. Some came to see if it was true, others to praise, others to judge. A hearing was scheduled. Mercer expected the stage to tilt back. There were calls. There were threats twice removed into the night. Mara sat through it all like a stone retaining its particular warmth. She testified, not with theatricality, but with currency, fact. The legal system, which claims to be dispassionate, took statements and made room for the idea that a spit in the face, in a public place, could be seen as more than insolence. The law, of all things, had the capacity to be slow and then to ordain that some slights deserve consequence. In the end, public opinion did what public opinion always does. It churned, then settled. Mercer's story dissolved into a pattern of behavior that, when collected, did not look good in the ledger. His commendations remained on the paper, but the sheen was gone for many who watched the clip and saw a man who could be toppled by a woman with a broom and a calm head. He was not prosecuted for grievous harm. He was fined for assault and mandated to attend an anger management program public enough to be cited on his resume like a scar. People cheered and jeered in equal measure. Mara received a handful of direct messages, some grateful, some terrifyingly entitled. Someone left flowers at the range with a note, for the woman who remembered how to be fair. She left them on Sam's counter and let the scent of lilies fill the room for a day. In the quieter aftermath, Mercer reached out. He sent a message through his lawyer, a brittle, oblique attempt at repair. He wanted to speak. He wanted to explain. He wanted to reclaim whatever remnants of dignity remained. Mara considered. She could have refused. There was pleasure in refusal, in the finality of silence. But she had never been motivated by the desire to punish someone's ego. She was motivated by the desire to hold a place where people could be safe and to be honest in a world that too often pretended otherwise. They met on a late afternoon at the range, when the light slant smoothed into a kind of golden anonymity. The rain had cleared, and the smell of the range was different now, not the raw iron but something like the clean tang of resolved argument. Sam made coffee. Derek hovered like an unsure mediation. Mercer arrived without his group this time. He was smaller when he was not performing. He had the look of someone removing armor and discovering the skin underneath cold. He said little at first, as if he didn't trust the words to do what he wanted, then said more than he meant to. "I'm sorry," he said. The words landed like tentative gifts. Mara watched him with a patience that could have been a weapon. "Why?" she asked. "Because I was a coward," he said, which was almost more accurate. Pride masks itself as courage, because cowards must be dressed as heroes to get by. He explained his culture of bravado and the echo chamber of command. He asked, with the awkwardness of someone who has only been allowed to be strong in public, whether there was a way back from the spectacle. Mara listened. There was no catharsis in his apology. It was simply a man naming what he could not otherwise bear to let lie. He did not ask for absolution so much as a confession. "You can change, or you can do good work for a while and then tilt back," Mara said at last. "Change isn't expensive. It's inconvenient. It's seeing the small things, the spit, the joke, and understanding why they are important. You learn to stop thinking you get to test people." He nodded like a man resolving to train. It was not immediate. People don't remake themselves overnight, even on the back of viral evidence and fines. But he had started. He had recognized his reflection as something that needed altering. In the weeks that followed, he did small things, volunteered at a veterans program, spoke at a group about humility, worked with anger management. The change was not a headline. It was a quiet sequence of days he would not have had without being forced to look in a different direction. Mara returned to her routines, sweeping brass, teaching the young men and women who came nervous and left steadier. She kept her mouth shut when people praised her. She did not like applause that turned into identity. She liked the plants on her windowsill, the steady ritual of tea, the small piece of a job done well. On a late summer morning, Derek, less green, more sure, approached her with the quiet ambition of a person who had stepped into their own capacity. "You ever think of teaching outside?" he asked. "Like at a formal school? You could do a lot." Mara laughed the first time she had in months, bright, startled. "I like my lane," she said. "The lane is honest." "You could make a difference, though," Derek persisted. She considered it. "There are doors in life that open into other lives if you push them." Mara had always stood at thresholds, watching. Maybe one day she would step across. For now, there was peace in the rhythm she had. At the end of the day, when the range cleared and the lights hummed off one by one, she swept the last of the brass into a box and wiped the counters. Sam brought out 2 black coffee cups and set one on the bench. "People will tell this story in 100 ways," he said. "They already are," Mara said. "They'll tell the story about the commander knocked down in 5 seconds. Sam winked. "That's the 30-second version. There's more to it, but it's quieter." Mara smiled. "The quiet is the interesting part." Outside, the sky went the color of old coins. The world had not unmade itself. Men like Mercer still walked out there, some willing to change, some not. But a line had been drawn in a place small enough to be missed by the critics and public enough that it could not be ignored. People would remember. Some would lionize, some would mock. But for the people who came to the range, the law and the line mattered more than any spectacle. They came for the one thing the world often forgot: the discipline to keep people safe and the courage to hold someone accountable when they crossed a small but sacred boundary. And sometimes, rarely, like a comet cutting the night, one person's quiet competence would topple another's cheap spectacle in 5 small, deliberate seconds, and the resulting silence would be enough to change the story.